Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll get started in about a minute. Okay. Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Corey Johnson with the Safe Routes Partnership, and I will be your presenter today for our webinar, Working Together to Make Meaningful Change, Engaging Communities Across Colorado. We have a lot planned for today, all about the wonderful topic of community engagement. So I'm excited that you all are here joining us. I'm looking forward to getting started. Before we begin, I'm going to pass it over to Melissa Chakosky-Houghton from CDOT and Colorado Safe Routes to School to talk a bit about our webinar series and to welcome you to our session today. So Melissa, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Okay. Great. Hello, everyone, and Happy New Year. As Corey mentioned, this is our second series of webinars that we're launching this year, starting this year. We're excited to be partnering again with the Safe Routes Partnership. They have incredible knowledge that they could share with the state, and we're glad that they can be part of this work with us. As Corey mentioned, my name is Melissa Chakosky-Houghton. I'm the consultant for Safe Routes to School. My company is Empower Consulting and Coaching, and part of our team is Wendy McMillan, and she is also here on the webinar today. And Wendy handles our communication and special events. So I don't want to take too much more time, but just wanted to thank you for joining us today. We hope that you pick up some different things from today's webinar. And also, if you are planning to apply for funding in the future from us, we would love to see any of these strategies incorporated into your grant application as part of the work that you're doing in your own community. So thank you so much. And Corey, I guess it's back to you.
Thanks, Melissa. All right, so to get us started today, just a few housekeeping items before we really dive in. As I mentioned, my name is Corey Johnson. I'm with the Safe Routes Partnership. For those of you who know us already, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. And for those of you who might be new to our organization, Safe Routes Partnership is a national organization, and our mission is to advance safe walking and rolling to and from schools and everyday life, improving the health and well-being of people of all races, income levels, and abilities, and building healthy, thriving communities for everyone. Just a little quick Zoom refresher, if anybody needs it. The session will be recorded today, so we will send out a copy of the recording and the presentation slides, hopefully later on this afternoon, so keep an eye out for that. All participants are on mute right now, but we do encourage everybody to participate in the chat. I will say that throughout the session, there are going to be a few opportunities to participate in the chat. I have a few questions for you all just to get your creative juices flowing. And because this is about community engagement, we really do encourage people to participate and share and explore and question, because that's a big part of what community engagement is all about. So please use the chat. We'd love to hear from you and have you participate in that way. So as I mentioned, I'm today's main presenter. My name is Corey. I'm based out of Washington, D.C., so a bit far from Colorado, but happy to be here and learn more about your beautiful state. And I also have Michelle Lieberman, who is our Consulting and Program Support Director, who's joining us today from Orange County, California. She's here to provide some tech support and backup, so Michelle is on as well. We'd also like to just hear from you all, from the audience, see who else is on today. So in the chat, this is our first opportunity to dive in and participate. We'd love for you all to share your name, your connection to Safe Routes to School, if you have one. If you're a Safe Routes to School practitioner, champion, coordinator, I'd love to hear how you're connected to this work. And then if you could offer a word to the group. And this word can be anything. It can be something you're feeling, something you're thinking about. You don't have to explain what the word is. It could be a wish for the new year, just something that you would like to offer the group today. You could say pickles, and I'll have no idea what pickles means, but it might mean something to you. So if you could take a moment in the chat box, please just introduce yourself. I see Lisa from Fort Collins got us kicked off. Thanks, Lisa. Her word is focus. Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, and we'll just take a moment to see who's with us today. Self-care, good one. Mobility, snow. We had some snow here in the DC area this past week or so, a few snow days. So I definitely hear that one. Cold, another one we've been experiencing here in DC. Lots of cold people. Positive, that's a great one. Fun, awesome. Great. So keep the words coming. I'm really enjoying just kind of seeing who's with us today. And yeah, hopefully we'll get to learn more about each other as we continue on with our session today. So thank you all so much for being here. And again, like I said, please feel free to use the chat as we go through our session today. All right, so just a quick run through of our agenda. We're wrapping up our introductions now, and then I'll start off by kind of framing this conversation around community engagement and equity, and why it's important, and why we created this community engagement guide specifically for Colorado. And then we'll follow up with our community engagement framework, which I'll go through a bit more in depth. And those of you who've seen the guide already were probably familiar with this framework, but we'll talk a bit more about what each of these steps mean. So reflect, research, partner, plan, implement, and sustain. Then we'll have some time for a Q&A throughout the session and also at the very end, and then a little closing reflection activity, followed by some reminders and next steps. So we have a lot to cover. I'll also mention that if we don't get to everything today, or if we happen to go over some things quickly, our next session is kind of like a follow-up to this session. So we'll have time to dig into a lot of these topics more in depth in our February webinar. So no worry, there's time for everything. All right, so why are we here today? We're here to talk about the Colorado Community Engagement Toolkit, which I worked really closely with Melissa, who we heard from earlier, and Wendy, and also the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment to put together this toolkit. It was a few years in the making. It was kind of like something we had started talking about a while ago as a dream, and we were actually able to put it together. So it's exciting that it's out there in the universe. So the Colorado Community Engagement Toolkit basically outlines a community engagement framework for equitable community engagement. And like I mentioned, it was pretty much created in collaboration with Safe Routes to School and the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and then Colorado DOT. It highlights engagement best practices, includes different guiding questions for you to think about as you're moving through the engagement process, features a lot of really great Colorado programs, examples of things that are happening. We also have a lot of links to toolkits, other tools, worksheets, and additional resources. Like I mentioned, there's really heavy emphasis on equity in this toolkit. So you might be thinking, why focus on equity? Why is this something that we kind of wanted to ground this toolkit in? And so I wanted to spend a moment just talking a bit about why this toolkit was created and highlight some of Colorado's commitments to equity, which I think are really, really great. So the Colorado Office of Health Equity defines equity as when everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from, has the opportunity to thrive. And this requires eliminating barriers like poverty and repairing injustices in systems such as education, health, criminal justice, and transportation. So these equity initiatives are really something that's coming from, a state level in Colorado, which is really exciting to see. And I did want to highlight one other resource that we're not going to go into depth. We're not going to go in depth into this resource today, but I did want to highlight it for you all because it is really great and kind of gives some more context around equity initiatives in Colorado specifically. So the Colorado Office of Health Equity does have an equity action guide that really focuses mainly on racial equity, but also includes information on, rural communities, which also have a lot of people of color, obviously, and explores different action steps that are taken to improve outcomes in housing, transportation, and other sectors. And so this was a really great tool for me to look at as I was putting our community engagement guide together, because I got an understanding of what the state of Colorado is really thinking about as far as different equity initiatives and goals, and just learning a bit about what you all are focusing on at the state level. And within this guide, and I won't read through this whole thing because I want to make sure we get to the bulk of our community engagement toolkit, but there's a great executive summary about equity and inequity in Colorado, and how, there are some individuals living in Colorado who might have been left behind due to systemic inequities, due to social norms, and not all communities have the same opportunity to thrive and participate in the decision-making processes that impact how we live our lives, how we get around our communities, how we live, how we learn. So I would definitely suggest taking a look at the Equity Action Guide, and I will put a link both in the chat box and also I'll send one out at the end of this session if you want to take a bit more look at this wonderful resource. But I did want to highlight that guide a bit. And also, again, just thinking about why equity matters, especially in a Colorado context. There are clear health disparities between non-white and white people living in Colorado, and the demographics are also changing across the state. So racial and ethnic minorities are predicted to comprise about 46% of Colorado's population in 2050. Compared to about 30% in 2015. So those demographic changes are, again, really a new need to, engage different community members, bring people into, into our programs and into the decision-making processes. So I did want to highlight just some statistics around Colorado as well. Hispanics will also comprise the largest share of Colorado's racial and ethnic minority population by 2050. That's another statistic that was in the Equity Action Guide, and just a few more numbers and statistics for you to look at. I will say that I'm using the term Hispanic because that's what was in the guide and in the data set that I was looking at. There were other terms, so I'm just going by what was listed in this set of data. So Colorado's changing, and that means that there are new opportunities to engage people who might not have been engaged in the past. And just a bit about what equity looks like, meeting people where they are, having processes and results that are both fair and just, removing barriers so everybody can thrive, and then equity is what you do and how you do it. And thinking about equity from a safe routes to school context, it is one of our 6 E's, and our equity E says that equity is ensuring that safe routes to school initiatives are benefiting all demographic groups, with particular attention to ensuring safe, healthy, and fair outcomes for low-income students, students of color, students of all genders, students with disabilities, and others. So Colorado's working on equity, Safe Routes to School is working on equity, and we wanted to make sure that that framework is really clear before we jump into the community engagement guide. So I'm going to pause just for a moment to see if there are any questions. Michelle put the Equity Action Guide in the chat, so thank you very much for that. All right. So I know we could probably do a whole webinar just on equity, but I did want to jump into our community engagement piece and just kind of lay the equity framework. So So we talked about equity a bit, and now we're thinking about community engagement. So why focus on engagement? And basically, when I think about equity and I think about engagement, I say that if equity is kind of like the end goal, and community engagement is a large part of the way that we get there. So if there are people who've been traditionally left out of safe routes to school, or policy-making decisions, or decision-making decisions, or collective storytelling, then it's our job to kind of help work towards eliminating those barriers, and giving the power back to community members, especially people who, again, have been left out of a lot of these processes. And so we do that through community engagement and through working together. So today's session will really think about what this type of community engagement looks like, and how we can work together to shift those power dynamics and involve more people in our programs and decision-making processes. And on the Safe Routes to School level, engagement is another one of our E's. So all Safe Routes to School initiatives begin by listening to students, families, teachers, and school leaders, and working with existing community organizations and building intentional, ongoing engagement opportunities into the program structure. So just like how equity is important for Safe Routes to School, engagement is important for Safe Routes to School. And again, I think a lot of us know this, but it doesn't hurt to just give another reminder of why engagement matters. It builds community and social connectedness, uplifts underrepresented voices, helps us determine what the needs of the community are, increases program participation, holds people accountable for doing what they say they're going to do, and provides a roadmap for building a more just and equitable society. So like I said earlier, engagement is a big way of how we get to a more equitable place. Community engagement is also a lot about relationship building and creating opportunities to connect with each other. So you'll hear me talk a lot today about connecting with other people, partnerships, talking to each other. All of those things are such a huge part of community engagement and the work that we do. So you will hear me encourage you all to get out and talk to people and share stories and build those authentic relationships, because that's really the heart of our community engagement work. And just thinking about who we engage, everybody from students to parents, school districts, local organizations, local government staff, our bike ped advocates, crossing guards, bus drivers, community members, neighbors, everyone, and anybody can be engaged in Safe Routes to School. I'm sure there are other people who I missed on this list. So if you have any others you want to add, feel free to put them in the chat. When we talk about community engagement, really talking about, everybody, those people who live, work, learn, play in the communities where you're working. And as I just mentioned earlier, and like I said, I will continue to mention, a huge part of community engagement is being able to talk to each other, especially people who might not look, think, or act like you. And I will say this over and over and over again. This is such a key point of community engagement. I know that some of my community partners who I'm closest with are people who I'm like totally different from them. And a lot of our partnerships started by just talking to each other, either going on a walk together or getting coffee or tea together. If you forget everything else from this webinar today, just remember that talking to each other is really important. And I'll also say, on a personal note, I'm a total introvert and really enjoy like spending time on my own. But I'm also able to, get out there and actually talk and connect with people. It's such a huge part of what I do. So for the introverts out there who, might get a little tired just saying go out and talk to people, trust me, if I can get out there and do it, you can totally do it too. So talk to each other. All right, so let's dive a bit into our guide that I mentioned earlier, Working Together to Make Meaningful Change, a toolkit for engaging communities across Colorado. I mentioned at the top of the agenda that I mentioned at the top of the meeting that we created a community engagement framework that you can, follow as you're going through your community engagement process. So this framework is really based around 6 different action steps. The first being to reflect on your role as a community partner, researching the community that you're working with, partnering with other organizations to build community relationships, planning thoughtful, culturally responsive community engagement experiences, implementing your community engagement experiences and events, and then finally sustaining your community engagement beyond a single event or initiative. So I'm going to walk through each step of the framework and give some examples of what these different steps look like, how you can incorporate them into your work. And again, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat. So the first step of our community engagement framework is reflecting on your role as a community partner. And I think the reflection is an important part of any kind of work, and it can happen at any time. So I wanted to kind of start off this framework by thinking about how do we reflect on our work and how can that reflection kind of set us up to be successful in our community engagement moving forward. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to ask you all to participate in the chat box multiple times throughout this session. So in the chat, I'd love for you all to share something that excites or interests you about community engagement, or something that makes you feel uneasy or unsure about community engagement, just to kind of get a little reflection going today during this session. So what's exciting for you, or what might make you a little nervous or uneasy or unsure? And you can just respond right in the chat box. I know that something that excites me is getting to hear different people's stories. I love listening to people tell stories about where they're from, what they like to do, what they like to eat. That's exciting to me about community engagement. What makes me unsure about community engagement, sometimes I feel like language changes so quickly, like the words that we use, the terms that we use, like a word that might be relevant 1 year is, not okay the next year. So I always struggle kind of thinking about, am I saying the right thing, or am I using the right term? Am I offending somebody? That kind of makes me a bit unsure about community engagement sometimes, but I give myself some grace to learn and grow. Okay, let's see. Exciting, the ideas that are generated. Uneasy, language barriers. I definitely understand that one. Learning about your community, definitely. Let's see, what else do we have? Exciting being a matchmaker and connecting groups. I like that one too. Program expansion. Great, great, great. So again, keep your ideas coming. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout this session. So thinking a bit about why reflection matters and why it's important to really take this time. Reflection really grounds your work and gives you purpose. It helps you identify your strengths and weaknesses as a community partner. It also gives you a chance to kind of acknowledge your power and privilege in relation to the community that you're engaging. So, for example, if you are a white person who's working in a community of color, you might reflect on, okay, what does that mean? What does that look like? What types of power and privilege might I have that this community does not have? If you're somebody who's working in a rural community that might not have as many resources as the community where you are, what do those power and privilege dynamics look like? Reflection is also an important part of building trust with the community. I think that, like I just mentioned with the power and privilege conversation, being able to show that you've done some reflecting on how your presence in the community might impact the people there, I think is really important, and that thoughtfulness helps build trust. And again, as I mentioned earlier, especially if you're a white person working in a predominantly community of color, thinking about those power dynamics and those privilege dynamics are extremely important. And we talk a lot in the guide about what that looks like, and some questions and exercises that you can do to think about your impact in the community. And what does reflection look like? So reflection can look like anything from a conversation with yourself, journaling, taking a solo walk or a ride. It can be talking with other people. It's about being open and honest, and also being uncomfortable at times. I think that somebody might have mentioned, a language barrier kind of making you feel a bit uneasy or unsure about community engagement. That happens to me all the time. If I'm, speaking and I mess up a word in Spanish, I'm like, oh, I know that I didn't say it right, but I'm trying. So there are those uncomfortable moments. Or if you're in a new community for the first time and you're entering somebody else's a space, it's okay to feel uncomfortable. It's something that's natural and that happens, and it's also just a part of the reflection process. So be open to being uncomfortable, I would say. So our community engagement guide also includes some reflection questions that you can ask yourself. You can either do this as a team or do it, like I mentioned, you can do it by yourself. But I think that, starting off by asking some of these questions will really help you, like I said, ground your work and give you purpose for why you're actually doing community engagement. So these are just a few sample questions that we included in the guide, just asking yourself, what do you already know about this community? How did you gain this knowledge? What positions of power and privilege do you have, and how do those impact the community that you're working with? What does community engagement look like in the past in this community, and what does it look like now? And then what keeps you doing the work that you do? So questions like these, again, really help ground your work and give you a sense of why you're in this community in the first place. And it's just a great way to, get started thinking about what community engagement will look like for you. The guide also talks about creating community engagement commitments. So community engagement commitments are basically a set of standards or norms for community engagement. They really help, hold yourself accountable, and you can also involve community members in creating these commitments. So basically, community engagement commitment is just saying, I'm going to do what I say I'm going to do. So I'm going to commit to listening more than I speak, or I'm going to commit to connecting with new community members, or I'm going to commit to making my events accessible to people who have disabilities. Whatever those commitments are, I think that once you're done reflecting, it's good to kind of put something down on paper and say, okay, I've reflected, now what am I going to commit to doing better? So involving some sort of commitment making process as a part of your reflection is really important. And again, a key part of setting off your community engagement efforts to really be successful as you move through the process. And again, in the guide, there are links to an exercise that will show you how to create community commitments and a list of questions to kind of spark that thinking as well. So all of that is in the guide. I just wanted to make sure that I pointed that out there for you here too. And then specifically reflecting on safe routes to school, reflection can be done at any time, not just the start of the school year. It can be done in the middle of your program, during spring break, after an event. You can always reflect on how you're working on safe routes to school. I would also suggest doing some reflection activities with other safe routes to school practitioners or community partners. I know that sometimes it can feel like you're working completely on your own in safe routes to school. So you have a little, if you have a safe routes to school buddy or cohort that you can talk with about some of these reflection questions, I would definitely encourage you to do that. You can also make reflection fun. You can do it by going on a walk or a ride, or creating a photo collage of past events, or journaling, or just sitting in a coffee shop. And even making just 5 or 10 minutes for reflection is better than nothing. So make the time for it. The time for it's really important. So that is our reflection piece. I will pause and see if there are any questions before we move on to our community research. Questions? I'm glad that people are so excited about community engagement. That's a plus, and that's what I like to hear. All right. So the next part of our framework is super fun, I think, and it's about researching the community where you are working. And by research, I don't mean like, going and writing a full thesis or anything. I mean just getting to know the community that you're working with. So another chat opportunity for you all. Think about a community where you work, or that you want to work with. What are you interested in learning about that community? And even if you work somewhere for like a really long time, there's always something new to learn because communities are always changing. So, for example, I like art a lot. So when I think about communities that I'm working with, I'm always interested in seeing about who the artists are, if there's public art, if there's a museum or cultural spot in the community, if there's street musicians. That's what I am really interested in learning about whenever I go to a new community. So I'm curious for you all in the communities that you're working with or might be working with, what are you interested in learning about? And it can be anything. So go ahead and take a moment and respond in the chat, please. Let's see. Where do people go for trusted sources of information? That's a good one. If there are any public holidays that bring people together throughout the year, interested in learning how to make pedestrian and bicycle access safer and easier, what their actual needs are, great. Where do people enjoy walking and biking? Great, great, great. All right, so keep your ideas coming, please. And these are all great. What the kids know that the adults don't know. I love that one because there's always something, right? Kids will always be thinking about something that adults just never considered. So awesome, awesome question. All right, so keep your questions coming and I'm going to keep us moving along. So why does research matter? Research matters because this helps you build your understanding of the community. You know, it's one thing to read about somewhere or see what somebody says about a community on the news, but actually getting out and talking to people and walking around or riding around and learning about what the community looks like on the ground is a big part of building your own understanding. It also gives important context around persisting inequities, is really important as far as building trust with community members, shows a willingness to learn about others' perspectives. Sometimes people like to have all the answers and community research shows that you don't have all the answers and that's okay. The community knows best. So that willingness to learn is really important. It can help inform your future programming. So the more information that you have, the better you can plan your program to meet the community's needs. You know, if you're encouraging people to walk or bike and there isn't a sidewalk or a bike lane or there's some other barrier to walking and biking, that information can help you determine the best way to, you know, promote walking and biking. And maybe there's a solution that you hadn't considered that you can now think about since you have the information. Research can also help dispel negative narratives around communities of color, low-income communities, rural communities. Like I said, you can, you know, learn about a community from watching something on the news and think that, you know, that's everything that has to do with that community. When in reality, you get out and walk around and talk to people and you realize like, oh, this is a place where people live just like anywhere else. So it kind of lets you learn from community members about how they want their community to be perceived. So it's a big part of why community research is so important and so valuable. Research can look like so many different things. So it can be taking a walk or ride around the neighborhood, jumping on the bus or the train or bike share, even doing like historical or archival research if there's a historical society just to learn about, you know, who was here before the people who were here and how was this community, this neighborhood, this town, you know, how was it founded? All of that's really interesting and also plays a big role in you know, what communities are like today. Attending different community events, so farmers markets, cultural fairs, you know, museum openings, bike rides, just things that people, sports games, can tell you a lot about what a community really values. Having casual conversations with people. Again, as I mentioned earlier, talking to people is extremely important. So if there are opportunities for you all to just chat with community members, that's helpful. Going on a guided tour, if there's like a neighborhood tour guide, that could also be fun, or like a historical trail. It's learning about the nuances within communities. Just because people live on the same street or the same neighborhood doesn't mean that they all think the same. So research can be learning a bit about how people in a community can be different. And even just by exploring Google Maps or Google Earth, that can be a great way to learn about a community. Since I work nationally, I can't get to every community that I work with. So I feel like I'm on Google Maps or Google Earth all the time. And while it's not the same as being, you know, on the ground, it can still tell you a lot about what a community looks like. Even just like knowing what restaurants from the area is cool and interesting. At least it is to me. So when you think about research for safe routes to school, this can look like anything from, you know, exploring local walking trails to learning about the history of safe routes to school in the community. You know, how did this program get started? why is it continuing? Learning about how different schools, neighborhoods, and landmarks got their names. That's a really cool way of kind of incorporating some research in safe routes to school, especially the school names. You're like, how in the world did the school get this name? Is it named after a person or an event or something that was here before, or a natural, a stream or a mountain? So that's a great way of kind of doing some school-based research. Attending different school events. So beyond your, walk to school day or bike rodeos, or there are other things you can go to, back to school night, or, a school fair, or other opportunities to connect with parents and families who might be interested in safe routes to school if you haven't connected with before. Grabbing a snack or lunch from a local spot. Also another way to get to learn a bit more about the community that you're working with. And my last suggestion is a community scavenger hunt, either virtual or in person. So I love scavenger hunts. I think they're super fun, and are pretty easy to create if you want to create your own. But even if you just create, a list of 5 things you're going to go out and explore about a community, and see if you can find those 5 things. That can be a great way to learn about the community that you're working with. So it can be something like, find a bike rack, or, find a sidewalk that's missing, find a store that has a Spanish name, anything. That can be a great way to get yourself out there, researching and exploring and learning a bit about the community that you're working in. Any questions about research? We move on. Okay. So next is partnership. So partnering with other organizations to build relationships. Partnership is a huge part of what we do, especially because so many of us are working solo or maybe a small team. So, our partnerships are kind of what keeps this whole thing, going and moving. So again, in the chat box, think about who are your community partners and if there are any potential partnerships you would like to explore. I work really closely with our local Safe Kids Coalition here in DC. They've been amazing partners. So that's a wonderful partnership that has really helped, some of the work that I've been doing, here at Safe Routes. So if you all have any community partners you want to highlight or shout out, feel free to put that in the chat box, and also any other partnerships you would like to explore. You might give people some ideas of different partnerships they might not have thought about before. So take a moment, respond in the chat. Any current partnerships, any partnerships you want to explore, even thinking about partnerships between different Safe Routes to School programs can be great. And as people start adding ideas to the chat, I'm going to move on and talk a bit about why partnership matters. So partnership matters, again, because it really helps stretch your resources. We all are asked to do a lot with very little. So having community partners come in can really help add to our resource pile. Partnerships help build community, increase capacity, increase buy-in, helps bring accountability, expand our knowledge. A lot of times our partners might know something that we don't know. So it just only makes us better and more informed. And also everybody needs support, especially if we're working on our own, so I think that having those extra hands on deck or that sounding board is really important. I did notice in the chat a few people wrote about working with senior walking groups and older adults. Great idea, great opportunity to bring in it's like some intergenerational programming possibly. I love the idea of working with older adults and people who are, older and active and involving them in Safe Routes to School in some way. So thanks for those suggestions. So partnership can look like co-leading events, co-marketing and co-branding materials, volunteer engagement, participating in task forces, just having regular check-ins or chats. Sometimes I just go out and have, coffee or lunch, or I guess these days Zoom with my community partners just to catch up and see what everybody's up to. Having group brainstorming sessions and also building coalitions. And in our toolkit, we talk a bit about coalition building. So again, in the partnership section, we have a whole section that's all about how to build a coalition of diverse partners. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And partnership ideas. So beyond the ones that you all mentioned in the chat box, parents and caregivers, obviously for Safe Routes to School, are great partners. Youth groups, crossing guards, local agency staff, artists, a lot of Safe Kids coalitions, like I mentioned earlier, farm and agricultural groups, great partners, especially for our rural communities, environmental organizations. And like I mentioned, you all put some other great ones in the chat as well. And so for partnering for Safe Routes to School, like I said, this can look like a lot of things you all are already doing. So inviting local agency staff to help at events like Walk or Bike to School Day, having pop-up demonstrations, maybe involving a local artist to do a pop-up crosswalk or bike rack. That can be a lot of fun. Doing public service announcements on radio or TV. A lot of communities still get information from their local radio or TV station. So finding out who the local media people are and involving them in Safe Routes to School. Talking to neighbors and trusted community leaders, kind of like those people who are in the know. Think about like the nosy neighbor concept, for lack of a better word. There are people in the community who know what are going on and who might not have like an official title or role, but they have a lot of influence. So find those people. It could even be like the lady who's, sitting on her front porch all day. She probably knows more than she lets on. So how can you find those people? And then also distributing Safe Routes to School materials at the local library, rec centers, businesses, transit centers, other places where people are going a lot and where there's a lot of foot traffic. Those are a few different partnership options for Safe Routes to School. All right, so next, you've done a lot of research, you've reflected, you've partnered. Now it's time to start planning your event and planning thoughtful and culturally responsive community engagement experiences. And like I mentioned, our next webinar is kind of like a follow-up to this one. So we'll talk a bit more in depth about what culturally responsive community engagement and programming looks like. But I did want to just give a little quick intro today before we dive into that more in our next, in our next webinar. So if you all have any activities that you're planning in the next few months, put them in the chat. And if there are any new activities that you want to try. So I know that I guess Bike to School Day will be coming up in May. If you have any other things happening this spring, I'd love to hear what you're currently planning and working on as we start thinking about how to plan culturally responsive community engagement experiences. So in the chat, please, any programs or activities that you're planning on for the next few months. And if there's anything that you would like to try out, go ahead and add that in the chat box. And while you're adding that, I'm going to talk a bit more about why planning matters. So planning matters because it really provides a roadmap to help you implement your event successfully. It gives you an opportunity to also troubleshoot. So if there are some things that you might not have thought that could be an issue, but are an issue, having a plan helps with that. It helps you integrate the knowledge that you gain from your community research. Shows how you value the community, creates opportunities for public participation. And planning is great, but also don't overcomplicate it. You don't have to have this full 20-page document of what you're trying to do. So be thoughtful, but you don't have to go totally overboard with everything. So planning can look like everything from, seeking input from people who might not normally participate in your program. It can be working on budgets, translating materials, consulting your community partners, looking at different spaces to host events. Not everything has to be hosted in a school or in a meeting hall. You might want to host something in a park or in a museum. So planning can look like lots of different things. I am going to touch on this briefly, but I'll go into it more in our next webinar. There's also a great tool called the Spectrum of Public Participation, which was designed by the International Association for Public Participation. And this gives you a few different ideas for how to involve community members in your planning processes. So everything from just telling somebody that something is happening to really working and collaborating on a deeper level with community members. So like I said, I'm going to go into this more in our next session, but I did want to call attention to this because it's important and we will come back to it. So this is a little teaser for you all. There's also a youth engagement continuum as well that we'll talk about more in our next webinar. So hold that thought for a moment just a teaser. More is coming about what that looks like. And thinking about planning specifically for safe routes to school. Oopsies. Go back. We can. So planning can look like a task force. Having your school calendar on hand is a great and important way to make sure that your plan aligns with the school calendar. Building an appreciation days for volunteers, crossing guards, sharing your plan with others to get feedback, and also infusing some cultural elements into your plan, which again, we'll talk about more in our next session. And again, I also assume that a lot of you all are doing this already in your safe routes to school work. So kudos if you are already doing some of these things. If you have questions about planning, again, please feel free to add them into the chat box. I've loved all the ideas and knowledge that you shared so far, so keep them coming. So now you have your plan together, you work with your partners to put together this great community engagement plan, and next it's actually time to implement things. So I know that some of you said that you're thinking about some upcoming events. I saw something about Earth Day, I think. Bike to School Day, Bike to School Month is coming up. So you're already thinking about some events that are coming up in the next few months, which is awesome. So implementation matters because it's really your program in action. It builds momentum and excitement, gives you a chance to try out new and creative ideas, creates opportunities to connect with new people. And this is a time for you to really have fun and celebrate. And a lot of you already know what implementation looks like. So these are your core events, your outreach events, your community meetings, your walk to school and bike to school day celebrations, marketing campaigns, walking and rolling challenges, your educational activities and lessons. These days, implementation can look virtual or in person. I've seen a lot of really interesting and creative, virtual walk and roll challenges and activities. I would encourage people to continue thinking about both virtual and in-person options for implementation. And like I mentioned, bike rodeos, pop-up demonstrations, having a listening session about safety concerns in the community, organizing remote drop-off and pickup sites, especially with the school bus shortage. I've seen a lot of safe routes to school programs looking into this as a potential solution. Walking school bus programs, walk audits, safety campaigns, competitions. I'm sure you all have plenty of others. If you do, feel free to list them in the chat. But like I mentioned, implementation is really the bulk of, it's your main action, your main program activities. That's what implementation is all about. So all that hard work that you did ahead of time to, reflect and plan and partner and research, all that leads up to implementing your program and doing your activities. And all of those prior actions help you do that in a way that'll make your program hopefully both more accessible to people who might have been left out of your program before, and more equitable. Any questions about implementation before we move on to our last piece? I know we've covered a lot and have breezed through some of it, but I promise, like I said, this is an introduction. There will be more to come in future webinars, so do not worry. And lastly, after we've done all our work, we've implemented our activities, hopefully it went wonderfully, and we got a whole bunch of new people to participate who might not have participated before. The last step of the community engagement framework is thinking about sustaining community engagement beyond a single project or initiative. So, how can we ensure that Safe Routes to School becomes a program that can live on, and that's not just a walk to school day once a year or bike to school day once a year? How can we sustain this movement and sustain these partnerships? So sustainability matters because, again, it helps build that community trust and buy-in, creates opportunities for community members to lead, creates that continuity and sense of stability, and it really builds culture and community. To be able to say, like, Safe Routes to School is a part of our community culture, it's a part of our school culture. I think that would be, a pretty ideal end goal, or that, kids here, we walk and bike to school because we have the, we have the knowledge and the resources to do so. That's just what we do here. It's a part of our culture. That's what we're hoping for. Sustainability and safe routes to school. Sustainability can look like, it looks like those long-term relationships, those partnerships that you've had for, years, that you continue to nurture. It can also be supporting new leaders. So here, who are the new voices that are coming up with, different ideas you might not have tried before. Sustainability also looks like long-term funding for programming, which this is like a big one for people. That funding piece is super important. It can also look like adopting plans and policies. So, putting together a safe routes to school policy and having it be adopted so that it's something that, the wider community is committing to. That's a part of sustainability. Following through on your commitments. If you say you're going to listen more to community members, you need to follow through on that. If you're committing to, getting to learn more about the community, that's something that you're, so that's something that you're committing to and that you should do. So sustainability can also look like holding yourself accountable for doing what you say you're actually going to do. Regularly checking in with people. So, your community partners, the community leaders, neighbors, school staff, just saying, hey, I'm here, I'm still supporting you. Do you need anything? Here's what I need. Nurturing those relationships is really important. And then also just continuing to be a part of the conversation around the community. So you want to keep safe routes to school on people's minds and show that, you're still relevant and are still, providing an essential need to the community as far as making sure that students and, and staff can get to school safely. So you want to continue to, be in the mix and be a part of the conversation and make sure that, people know that safe routes to school is important. And as far as what this looks like on a safe routes to school level, I just mentioned safe routes to school plans and policies are a great way to kind of build sustainability into your program. Scheduling monthly or quarterly check-ins with stakeholders and community leaders, community partners, that can be helpful. Hosting those annual events to become a part of school culture. So walk to school day, that's something a lot of students look forward to. Every October, they're like, oh, it's walk to school day. So continuing those events is really helpful and, kind of helps safe routes to school become a part of the fabric of the community. Supporting other community-led initiatives, if there are youth walking clubs, biking clubs, transportation advocacy campaigns, Vision Zero campaigns, all of those things can also be tied into safe routes to school. So how can you partner up with some other groups who might be working on something similar to you? And also just creating time to regularly reflect and evaluate, on your program. So taking a step back and saying, okay, it's the end of the school year or the middle of the semester, how are things going? What needs to change? What do we need to improve upon? What's been successful? All of those things can help you sustain your safe routes to school program and kind of keep the momentum going as you look into the future. So before I wrap up and have a few minutes for questions. Again, if you remember nothing else from this presentation, please, 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 please remember that we have to be able to talk to each other. As I was writing this guide, I was thinking, gosh, I keep saying we have to talk to each other. I keep saying this over and over and over again, but it really is like the key part of community engagement and this work, being able to talk to one another, partner with one another, share stories, and connect, especially with people who might not look, think, or act like you. It's some of the most important work that we do. So, even just going out and having, like I said, coffee with a community partner, or taking a walk around the neighborhood, or doing a little Zoom chat with another Safe Routes to School coordinator, just something where we're kind of connecting and keeping these conversations going is a super, super, super important part of community engagement. So that was a lot of information. Like I said, just an introduction to the guide. The full guide goes into a lot more detail and gives in-depth examples of what all this looks like in practice. but I did want to just introduce you all to the framework today and give a brief overview of what this guide offers you and how you can use it in your practice. So I'm going to stop for a moment and see if there are any questions, comments, ideas. I'll take a look at the chat box really quickly to see if there's anything that's come up, and then we will close out our session for today. Let's see. Nora mentioned wanting to make a video of safe routes to school coordinators across the state, sharing what they're proud of and working on. I love that idea. I love videos, and I love people I love like celebrations of the great work that's going on. So I hope that that video happens and that you share it with me so I can see it. Great idea. Let's see, we have a few comprehensive plans happening. Let's see what else. Michelle asked, will you be providing contact information if we are wanting to? Yes, we will provide contact information, absolutely. And also a recording of the webinar and links to all the materials we talked about today. I'll send that out after our session is done today. Any other questions before we wrap up for today? Like I said, I know we covered a lot and it's just a brief intro, but there's more to come, and a lot of this will be shared in the guide as well. Let's see, I think there was one question that I might not have answered. Let me go back. Cami had a question about what other topics would discussing transportation fit into better versus it being a standalone topic since it's so intersectional. That's a really great question. So transportation doesn't exist, just like in a silo, right? It impacts everything. So transportation can be related to, everything from, housing, public health, education. It literally impacts every, every part of society and the way that we, get around and live and work and play. Cami, I got it. It was a comment. Got it. Thank you for that comment. And yeah, I definitely think talking with communities about how transportation impacts other parts of their life is super important. So thanks for sharing that comment. Any other questions before we move on and wrap up for today? All right, so we have about 2 minutes left, and just wanted to go over some next steps and reminders. So we are having, like I mentioned, our next webinar will be on February 9th at 11, and will be about culturally responsive safe routes to school programming. So like I mentioned before, this is just step one of a larger conversation we'll be having this year about community engagement and culturally responsive programming. We're also considering, pending funding, possibly offering some additional in-depth community engagement trainings. And so I'm curious, I'm just going to put a quick poll question on here for you all. If funding allows, would you be interested in an additional in-depth community engagement training? Probably something that's a bit more interactive, less presentation based. So I promise it won't be me speaking the whole time like I did today. I rarely do that, but that's just how this one turned out. So please take a moment and just express your interest, either yes or no, if that's something you'd like to participate in. As those plans develop, we will keep you all posted. All right, so I will keep our poll open for a few more minutes. Like I mentioned, our next webinar will be on February 9th at 11. We'll send out more details about that shortly. In the meantime, feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions, comments, ideas for upcoming webinars. I will also be sending out a recording of this webinar, the presentation slides, links to the guide and other materials we talked about today. So keep an eye out for that. It'll probably be coming sometime this afternoon. Otherwise, thank you all so much for joining. I really hope that we'll see you all on February 9th for kind of our second part of our community engagement series. So more information on that coming soon. Thank you all so much and enjoy the rest of your day. Hope to see you soon.